Alpha Lima Whiskey 301 Santo Domingo coming.
A Boeing 757 disappears
Alpha
from radar
Lima
with
Whiskey
189 people on
301
board.
Santo Domingo. Come
The
in,
plane's
please.
wreckage is soon found at sea. There are no survivors to say what happened.
This accident was the first major loss of a Boeing 757 aircraft.
Investigators find no clues in the wreckage. Only the plane's black box can tell them what happened. The tape raises a perplexing question.
301 Santo Domingo, come in, please.
My airspeed indicator is not working.
What's happening?
How had the failure of one single instrument caused the crash of one of the world's most sophisticated jetliners? Gregorio Luperon International Airport in Puerto Plata, the Dominican Republic. February the 6th, 1996. The small Caribbean island is a popular winter getaway. A group of German tourists has been delayed. There are mechanical problems with the jet that was supposed to take them back to Frankfurt. The airline has arranged to lease another plane for the flight. The replacement jet is owned by Turkish charter company Birgenair. They have a 757 that's been sitting on the tarmac for almost 3 weeks. But it takes several hours to get the plane ready to go, and to get the Turkish crew aboard. By 10:15 p.m., the plane and most of its crew are at the gate. More than 4 hours after they were supposed to take off, the first of the passengers begin boarding the plane. They have a 9-hour flight to Frankfurt ahead of them.
Alpha Lima Whiskey 301.
Shortly after 11:30, Birgenair Flight 301 is given permission to leave the gate.
Pushback granted.
Moments later, it taxis to the threshold of the runway.
Cabin crew, take your seats, ready for takeoff. Cabin announcement is completed. Exterior lights.
First Officer Aykut Gergin is new to the 757 with fewer than 75 hours in the plane.
Before
All in
takeoff
the last
checklist
3
completed.
months.
Thank you. Ready for takeoff.
In contrast, Captain Ahmet Erdem is one of Birgenair's most senior pilots. He's logged thousands of hours in this type of plane.
Alpha Lima Whiskey 301, ready for takeoff.
301, cleared for takeoff, runway 08.
Cleared for takeoff. Runway 08, 301. Thank you. A good flight.
Good flight.
Good flight.
Mulis Evrenesolu is on this flight as a relief pilot. Like First Officer Gergin, he's been flying the 757 for less than 3 months. As the plane accelerates to takeoff speed, a light rain begins to fall.
Power set.
Okay, check.
First Officer Aykut Gergin watches his airspeed indicator for a routine instrument check.
As the airplane's accelerating to takeoff speed, the first officer calls 80 knots.
80 knots. Check.
The captain, in theory, should verify that his airspeed indicator also reads 80 knots.
My airspeed indicator is not working.
The captain's airspeed should read the same as his first officer's,
120.
but the readings do not match.
Is yours working?
Yes, sir.
You tell me.
Erdem wants his first officer to tell him when the plane hits takeoff speed.
V1.
At 150 knots, the plane hits V1, the point of no return.
Rotate.
The captain must pull back on his column and get the plane in the air.
Positive climb, gear up.
Positive climb. Gear is up.
At 11:42, the plane takes off. Seconds later, Captain Airdem's airspeed indicator comes to life.
Is it possible to turn off the wipers?
Okay. Wipers off.
Climb thrust.
Climb thrust.
First Officer Gergin reduces power to the engines for a gradual climb to cruising altitude.
301, Airborne 45, switch over Santo Domingo, 1243.
1243, bye-bye, sir.
Climbing through 2,500 feet,
Santo Domingo, good evening.
First Officer
Alpha Lima
Gergin
Whiskey
establishes
301,
contact
climbing
with the
with you.
island's main tower in Santo Domingo.
Alpha Lima Whiskey 301, climb and maintain 280.
Center autopilot on, please.
Center autopilot, as command.
Thank you.
1 minute and 30 seconds into the flight, the autopilot takes over. Onboard computers now make all the calculations and adjustments necessary to keep the plane climbing safely. Almost immediately, the computer reports a problem.
Rudder ratio, Mach airspeed trim.
2 different alerts warn the pilots that the plane is traveling far too
Yes,
fast.
trim.
But the first officer's airspeed indicator shows the plane climbing at a normal speed, 220 knots.
Something's wrong here.
Unaware that there are any problems, the controller directs Birgenair Flight 301 to continue climbing.
Alpha Lima Whiskey 301, report Pokek.
Okay, 280, I'll call you over Pokek. 301.
Okay, there's something crazy. Do you see it?
In the cockpit, the situation gets more confusing. The first officer's airspeed indicator shows that the plane is flying much too slowly.
Mine shows only 200 now, and decreasing, sir.
But the captain's gauge shows the plane flying far too fast, 325 knots.
Both of them are wrong. What can we do? Let's check the circuit breakers.
Yes, sir.
As the first warning is eliminated, a more persistent warning replaces it. The overspeed warning tells the crew that they are approaching 350 knots, the maximum speed at which the plane was designed to fly at this altitude.
Okay, it's no matter. Let's pull the airspeed. Let's see.
Resetting the circuit breakers turns off the alarm, but it doesn't fix the problem. Captain Airdem's airspeed indicator still shows he's flying much too fast.
Now it's 350, yes?
Confused by the conflicting information, Captain Airdem decides to do what the plane wants. He slows
Let's
down.
take that like this.
With terrifying results. The 757 is sending out warnings that are confusing the crew. Bewildered, the crew struggles to solve the problem. The lives of 189 people depend on them getting the answer right. Shortly after taking off from the Dominican Republic, Birgenair Flight 301 is in trouble. The cockpit is filled with an ominous sound, the stick shaker alert.
A stick shaker warning is a warning of imminent stall. It means that the airplane is about to attain a speed so low that it cannot sustain flight.
The alert is so serious that it actually shakes the pilot's control columns. Combined with a loud rattling, it's impossible to ignore. To add to the crew's confusion, confusion, the plane begins to vibrate and dip wildly.
I'm sure every passenger on the airplane knew something was unusual because the aircraft started to shake in a very violent maneuver.
It's not the only problem the crew is facing.
AVI!
The attitude deviation indicator is basically a round gauge that on this airplane is a screen, but it's blue on the top and brown on the bottom, and it shows not only the pitch of the airplane, but also roll.
On the gauge, blue represents sky. The more blue, the steeper the climb. Right now it's showing that the plane's nose is pointing dangerously high. Then, more than 7,000 feet above the ocean, the plane rolls hard to the right and begins to plummet from the sky.
From the time that the stick shaker activates, it is now going to require proper action from the flight crew to sort this out, or they will end up losing control of it. The window of decisions is closing on them, for if they let it stall completely, maintaining control of the airplane will prove to be very difficult.
Captain Airdem struggles desperately to get his plane to climb.
Nose down.
He has just a few thousand feet to pull a 100-ton airliner out of a deadly storm. The less experienced pilots utter prayers and offer suggestions.
Thrust.
AVI! 301, squawk 377.
Stand by.
Air traffic control is still unaware that Flight 301 is in grave danger.
The timing. What am I to do? You can level off. Our altitude's okay.
The plane is falling fast.
Okay, 5,000 feet.
Captain Airdem is trying to fly a plane that's become virtually uncontrollable.
Press levers, press!
Gergin pushes the throttles to full power, but it doesn't help. The plane spirals towards the sea.
What's happening?
Alpha Lima Whiskey 301, Santo Domingo, come in, please. Alpha Lima Whiskey 301, Santo Domingo. Come in, please.
Less than 5 minutes after takeoff, Birgenair Flight 301
Alpha Lima Whiskey
vanishes from
301.
radar.
Come in, please.
The Dominican Navy begins searching for the missing plane and its passengers.
En la ruta me imaginaba siempre que iba a lo que me iba a encontrar. Pensaba que iba a encontrar gente gritando, gente llamando.
They discover something very different. The strong smell of jet fuel hangs over the water. Pieces of wreckage float on the waves.
Yo pensé dentro de mí, realmente no hay nadie sobreviviente aquí. No había sobrevivientes. Y no veíamos los cuerpos, pero pensé que el avión se había desintegrado realmente en el agua, con el golpe.
Within hours, more than just wreckage begins floating to the surface.
Hasta ese momento todavía no sentía como a eso de las 5:20 de la mañana, cuando los cuerpos comenzaron a salir. Sí, yo sentí en mi corazón sentí una honda pena realmente. Me sentí que no sabía si iba a sacar fuerza para poder hacer el trabajo en ese momento.
The search continues by the light of the next morning. American and Dominican rescue ships scour a 1,300 square kilometer area for survivors. None are found. Now it's up to the Dominican Republic's Aircraft Accident Investigation Bureau to find out what caused this accident.
Establecimos campamento en un hotel de la playa Cabarete, que estaba exactamente al sur de la posición del accidente.
Over the next couple of days, investigators, reporters, and some of the victims' families arrive at the hotel. Nearby, evidence of the disaster reaches the Dominican shores. Wreckage and passengers' possessions are washing up on the beach. Even the smallest piece could be a valuable clue as to what caused the crash. The USA's National Transportation Safety Board agrees to assist the Dominicans with their investigation.
Welcome to Dominican Republic. I'm Manuel Sufron.
They send an investigator to Puerto Plata.
We could see that this was going to take some international cooperation to get to the bottom of the event.
Robert McIntosh will also provide support from the NTSB's Washington offices.
Any signal from the recorders?
This particular accident was the first major loss of a Boeing 757 in the water. There was added urgency because the aircraft was going into the livery of many American-operated airlines and on the market for the worldwide passenger service.
In order to understand what had happened here, we only had one key. That key was the black boxes.
Like all commercial airliners, the Boeing 757 carries a cockpit voice recorder that records all the sounds in the cockpit, and a flight data recorder that records a wealth of information about the plane's operation during flight.
We've got underwater locator beacons on these recorders. They work for 30 days upon immersion.
But the ocean where the plane crashed is over 7,200 feet deep.
Necesitábamos localizarla
We
antes de
needed
que
to locate them
los
before the
localizadores
signals
se
faded,
apagaran.
and we also
Y luego
needed to remove
necesitábamos
them
sacarla
before
antes
the
de que los
data was
datos se
damaged by
dañaran
salt water.
por efecto
So we
del
were
agua
in
de
a
sal.
race against time.
Entonces estábamos en una carrera contra el tiempo.
The NTSB enlists the help of the US Navy, who hire a submersible called the Curve.
CURV stands for the Cabled Underwater Recovery Vehicle. It's a tethered vehicle. It has an umbilical, and it's controlled by an umbilical. It's not autonomous.
The Curve is essentially a remote-controlled submarine, which can work at depths no manned submarine could handle. While the Curve travels from the United States, Major Souffrant starts to examine the evidence he has. Radar on the ground tracked the plane as it climbed into the night sky.
And then I have the radar. The history of the flight is recorded here. So basically,
investigators study the radar records, along with the conversation between the ground controllers and the crew.
I have the recording from the control tower.
Santo Domingo, good evening. Alpha Lima Whiskey 301 climbing with you.
Alpha Lima Whiskey 301, climb and maintain 280.
Okay, 280.
The exchange between the controller and Flight 301 is normal. The investigators detect no signs of trouble.
Y la última comunicación entre ellos solamente se cortó por un espere un momento.
301, squawk 377.
Stand by.
As you heard, there's no reason why this plane went down.
What had caused something to go wrong to interrupt the flight path of the aircraft so rapidly? Certainly, it was a good question for us.
Any debris that's found is taken to a Dominican military base to be examined. Investigators comb through the wreckage they've recovered. Pieces of the cabin, life vests, even part of the landing gear have all been found. Every piece of debris is studied for signs of an explosion or fire. Investigators also check if any of the life vests are inflated. That would suggest passengers had some warning before the plane plowed into the sea. Cords on some of the life vests are hanging loose, but investigators conclude that could be the result of the plane's violent impact. The crash was so powerful, it has compressed coffee cans into flat pieces of tin. The wreckage tells investigators that the crash of Birgenair Flight 301 was sudden and violent. But they find no evidence that there was an explosion on board. Major Souffrant looks into the possibility that the plane, which was called into service at the last minute, may not have been ready for the flight.
Manuel Souffrant.
Ah, hi.
I'd like to see some records of the Birgenair plane.
Oh, they're right here. This is it.
It had been on the ground for some time in Puerto Plata, and that became interesting to us. Why would an operating company have an aircraft sitting there?
Investigators discover that the plane wasn't on the ground for repairs. Based on maintenance records, the plane appears to have been mechanically sound. Birgenair simply didn't have enough passengers to justify the flight financially. So they kept the plane and the crew in the Dominican Republic for almost 3 weeks. The plane's maintenance records turn out to be one more in a series of empty leads. The Curve arrives in Puerto Plata harbor. On February the 28th, more than 3 weeks after the crash, it slips below the waves, looking for the remains of the Birgenair jet. It takes the robotic submarine 2 hours just to descend the 7,200 feet to the ocean floor. From there, it sends back images of the wreck of Flight 301.
The cockpit pretty much was sitting upright, and it was pretty much the nose of the plane, and you could see the front part of it. It was obviously banged up and cracked and fragmented.
The clues investigators need to solve the mystery of this plane crash lie somewhere amongst the plane's twisted wreckage. The flight's black boxes are the top priority. The Curve quickly picks up the signal from a pinger on one of the units. Operators must now maneuver the sub towards the sound. They have to be able to see the boxes to pick them up with the robotic arm. It takes just 90 minutes to find the first black box.
The first one was sitting out in the open. Okay, it was where they could see it, and they picked the first box up. They grabbed a hold of it, and they just kind of tucked the arm up in place, so that they wouldn't lose it.
The second black box is also heard, but after almost 2 hours, the Curve's cameras still can't see it.
They knew it was right there, and they were searching around a debris pile, and they could not physically see it, with the cameras of the vehicle. So as they went around a couple times, they started, lifting metal up and moving pieces out of the way, and then they did find the second box under some debris.
Flight 301's flight data recorder and cockpit voice recorder are brought to the surface and loaded onto a waiting jet. Within hours, the black boxes are at the NTSB labs in Washington, D.C. Technicians prepare to extract the precious data from the boxes. Investigators hope it will tell them what happened aboard Birgenair Flight 301. They'll soon uncover a stunning miscommunication between a seasoned pilot and his plane. To unravel the mystery of Birgenair Flight 301, investigators are counting on the plane's black boxes.
That flight data recorder was our key. So the technicians got busy and gave us plots, visual plots of what was going on with engines and airspeeds and so on, to allow us to try and understand why that aircraft slowed down and then simply departed controlled flight and entered the ocean.
Ah, that's great. That shows us all we need to see for now. So it's all the flight data recording. It's on a timeline, top is the pitch. We've got the airspeed and the altitude. But check out the timeline, 44.
Investigators immediately notice something unusual about the flight.
15 degrees pitch, nose up. Seems high.
It's almost the maximum.
And then it stays that way.
The plane began climbing normally.
Center autopilot on, please.
But investigators noticed that shortly after the autopilot was switched on, the plane's nose pitched upward. They also see that the plane's airspeed seems much higher than it should be.
350 knots. It can't be right.
Oh, there's definitely something wonky about the airspeed numbers.
This brought us to the question of perhaps we should be looking over on the other side at the cockpit voice recorder and see what kind of information was coming from there.
Can you cue that up and play it?
Investigators soon start filling in the missing pieces of the puzzle.
80 knots?
My airspeed indicator is not working.
They learn that Captain Erdem noticed that his airspeed indicator wasn't working.
Fuel's working? Yes, sir.
You tell me.
V1. Rotate.
But Erdem didn't think the problem was serious enough to abort his takeoff. The tape reveals that once they were airborne, the crew quickly became overwhelmed by a series of warnings.
Rudder ratio, Mach airspeed trim, something
To investigators, the captain seems to become increasingly bewildered by the messages he was getting from his plane.
Mine shows only 200 now, and decreasing, sir.
Both of them are wrong. What can we do?
Investigators don't know why the captain's airspeed indicator wasn't working. They do notice that the captain's gauge came back to life as the plane started to climb.
Okay, it's no matter. Let's pull the airspeed. Let's see.
It's a telling discovery, which leads investigators to focus their attention on the device that feeds the gauge's airspeed information. The Pitot tube. A Pitot tube is an airspeed sensor. A pipe open at one end that responds to air pressure. When the plane travels forward, an increase in air pressure inside the Pitot tube causes the airspeed indicator's needle to move.
My airspeed indicator is not working.
But if a Pitot tube becomes blocked, it can send faulty readings to the plane's gauges. Blocked Pitot tubes have been a factor in previous plane crashes. In 1982, a Boeing 737 crashed in heavy snow in Washington, D.C. shortly after takeoff. The Pitot tubes were blocked with ice. Investigators suspect that the Pitot tube which fed the captain's airspeed indicator on the Birgenair jet was somehow blocked. But they know ice can't have blocked the tubes of a plane taking off from a Caribbean island.
We don't know why it was blocked, but it presented a very, very interesting situation to us. We started carefully looking at what could cause that kind of thing to happen.
Senor!
Major Souffrant has a theory. He returns to question the airplane's mechanics.
Senor Souffrant.
We are done with this, thank you. I'd like to ask you some more question about the Birgenair plane.
Souffrant suspects that mechanics may have taped over the Pitot tubes during maintenance. It's a common procedure, but if the tape wasn't removed, it could have caused the deadly accident.
Maybe a piece of tape was left on accidentally?
No, sir. They didn't have to be taped. We never did anything with the Pitos.
Did you put the Pitot covers back on them when the maintenance was finished?
It didn't have any covers with it. We didn't take any off, and we didn't put any on.
Y es ahí donde encontramos que los Pitot nunca estuvieron cubiertos en los 25 días que duró la aeronave en la rampa del Aeropuerto Internacional de Puerto Plata.
A Pitot cover slips over the end of the tube. Regulations state that these covers must be installed anytime a plane will be on the ground for an extended period of time. A prominent flag is meant to remind pilots and technicians to remove them again before takeoff. Investigators find that the Birgenair Pitot tubes were never covered, and somehow the uncovered Pitots had become blocked. Recovering the tube from the ocean floor is the only way for investigators to answer a pressing question. What blocked the Pitot tubes?
Nobody knows for sure. The evidence is 7,000 feet down in the Atlantic Ocean.
But even if the Pitot tubes were blocked, how could it have caused the crash of a modern jet and the death of 189 people?
It's not like a car where you have only one speedometer. In this kind of an aircraft, you have a total of 3 airspeed indicators, and there's a flight data computer which is computing the velocity in relation to the ground.
I'd like to welcome you all this afternoon. As you know, I'm Bob McIntosh.
Using information from the black boxes, the NTSB pieces together a real-time animation from liftoff to the final moments of Flight 301.
This is the indicator. The captain actually realized that his speed indicator was not working.
Is yours working?
Yes, sir.
The big question for investigators is how could one faulty airspeed source result in a crash?
He realized it at a time when he could have aborted, he could have turned back, but he chose to continue. Right now,
investigators analyze the captain's every move and find that he allowed a small error to escalate and ultimately overwhelm him.
Rotate.
Positive climb, gear up.
Moments after liftoff, Captain Erdem's airspeed indicator appears to be working.
And then that means it's at odds.
But investigators suspect the gauge is responding to changes in altitude.
Climb thrust.
As the plane climbs through the thinning atmosphere, the air trapped inside the tube expands, causing a buildup of pressure. Inside the cockpit, this causes the airspeed indicator needle to deflect. Even though altitude is causing the increase in pressure, the sensors mistakenly read it as an increase in airspeed.
So at this point, the takeoff is standard, nothing's...
Captain Erdem may have had 5 separate sources of airspeed to rely on, but investigators noticed that when the trouble started, he wasn't flying the plane.
Center autopilot on, please.
Center autopilot has command.
Thank you.
The autopilot was. And unless the crew reconfigures it, the autopilot gets its airspeed information from only one source.
Remember, the autopilot gets its data only from the captain's Pitot tube, the one that was blocked.
The data shows that the trouble on Birgenair Flight 301 began when the autopilot took over.
Right after the autopilot is engaged, the plane's nose begins to rise.
Investigators suspect that the crew didn't realize that the blocked Pitot tube was feeding the autopilot faulty information. The computer registered that the plane was traveling too fast and raised the nose to slow it down.
It soon rises to 15 degrees, then it stays there.
Raising the nose works like an air brake. It slows the plane by creating drag. The autopilot is programmed to never bring the nose higher than about 15 degrees. Any higher, and the plane would slow down too much and stall.
The autopilot's a pretty smart guy. He already knows he's got all the power that he's going to get for the climb. The only thing for the autopilot to do is raise the nose. And it raised the nose of the airplane to its limits of authority.
But the autopilot was reacting to faulty information. Moments later, it sent out 2 different warnings.
Rudder ratio, Mach airspeed trim.
That the plane was traveling too fast to be controlled safely.
And the airplane begins picking up warnings, rudder ratio, a variety of things that the airplane is sensing problems.
Okay, there's something crazy here. Do you see it?
Yes, there is something crazy. Mine shows only 200 now, and decreasing, sir.
Both of them are wrong.
Investigators realized that Captain Erdem wrongly concluded that both airspeed indicators were malfunctioning. In fact, his first officer's gauge was always correct. The plane was traveling much too slowly.
What can we do?
Captain Erdem no longer knows which instruments to trust.
Let's check the circuit breakers.
As they saw these caution lights, they decided they were going to start pulling some circuit breakers. That would be rather strange.
The actions of trying to reset circuit breakers is something that pilots of older generations aircraft have learned via experience of sometimes being able to get an errant system back functional.
Resetting the circuit breakers turns off the alarm.
But that needle continued to climb around the clock face until it activated the overspeed warning.
The autopilot system sent yet another warning that the plane was traveling too fast. But the reality was just the opposite. The plane was slowing down.
At this point, the overspeed indicator is on. They're going slow, they think they're going too fast, and confusion is set in.
Let's pull the airspeed.
That's when Captain Erdem made the gravest error of all.
You can see that he now pulls back on his throttles.
Investigators realized that at the plane's already slow speed, pulling back on the throttles was disastrous. The crew got the most severe warning that a plane can send out.
And that's when he gets the stick shift.
He's got a tactile sense coming through his flight controls that literally shakes the stick and says, "You've got to lower this nose."
In a matter of seconds, Captain Erdem was first warned that his plane was traveling too fast, and then that it was traveling dangerously slowly.
They're in direct opposition of each other, and two warnings that you would never expect to get one right behind the other.
The autopilot is programmed to always disconnect when the stick shaker activates. It's up to the pilot to get the plane out of the stall.
Once the autopilot reached its limits of authority, it said, "I've done all I can do. I'm out of here."
When the autopilot disengaged, Captain Erdem suddenly found himself in control of the plane at the moment of his greatest confusion.
If you watch the plane at the top of the screen,
the cockpit recordings lead investigators to a stunning conclusion.
ADI!
Captain Erdem may not have recognized that his plane is about to stall, but the relief pilot behind him did.
ADI!
This additional pilot intervened to say, "ADI, ADI." In other words, look at that ADI and put yourself where you would normally see the nose of the aircraft. 5 degrees nose high, 10 degrees.
So when the reserve pilot says ADI, he is attempting to focus the captain's attention to roll and pitch, which are becoming problematic.
The relief pilot wanted Captain Erdem to recognize that the plane's nose was pitched dangerously skyward. Investigators can hear First Officer Gergen trying to convey the same message.
Nose down.
At this point, the first officer is actually trying to lead the captain to some solutions, but not actually take control of the airplane.
What the 757 desperately needed was airflow over the wings to generate lift. The only way to get that was to point the nose down and dive. What puzzles investigators is that the first officer had a control column identical to the captain's. He could have pushed it and brought the nose down himself. He may have been able to save the plane. But he didn't. Instead, he and the other Turkish crew member continued offering suggestions to their more experienced but overwhelmed captain.
But climbing, what am I to do? You can level off, our altitude's okay.
The recording shows that Captain Erdem ignored valuable advice that could have saved the plane.
And in the Birgenair case, there's a case of a relatively junior first officer looking at one of the most senior captains on the airline. It is not culturally appropriate for him to say, "I'm going to take the airplane away from you." Instead, he tries to assist the captain, to lead the captain, but leave the captain in command. Other cultures, other training, other airlines may very well have required the first officer to physically take control of the airplane.
I think the social atmosphere in the cockpit will prevail to revere age and experience to the point where it can kill somebody. And in this case, it looks like it did.
The flight data recorder reveals that instead of pushing the nose down, Captain Erdem tried to get more speed from his engines.
At this point, the crew goes to full power.
Thrust levers, thrust!
At the angle the plane was falling, the engines couldn't get enough air. Applying full power was more than they could handle. The left engine quit first.
In a state of utter confusion.
With the right side at full throttle, the airliner swings around as though its left wing were caught on a branch.
The airplane goes into a classic full stall where the nose drops, it falls on a wing, which is now a very life-threatening condition.
The 757 itself makes the situation worse. Like many modern jets, it uses a so-called swept wing design. The wings angle slightly backwards to reduce drag and increase fuel efficiency. But the design has a downside.
One of the characteristics of swept-wing jets is they get less and less stable. They're much harder to fly as they approach stall.
Sir, pull up! What's happening? What's happening?
To maintain control of a swept-wing jet with no more altitude than they had in this condition is very, very problematic, and they are not successful when the airplane goes into the water.
Investigators now know why Birgenair Flight 301 crashed.
Okay, check.
What they can't understand is why the flight ever left the ground.
80 knots. My airspeed indicator's not working.
At 80 knots, if the pilot and co-pilot's instruments disagree, takeoff should be aborted.
V1.
Investigators are troubled that the captain took off knowing he had malfunctioning instruments.
Y si algo no está funcionando
If something
correctamente,
is not
no
functioning
importa
correctly,
qué,
it doesn't matter
la
what it
acción a tomar
is,
es
one should
abortar el
abort the
despegue
takeoff at 80 knots.
en los 80 nudos.
This decision on the part of the captain has been criticized, but there is a very short time window for this decision to be made.
Members of the investigative team in Puerto Plata try to find any clues that might explain why Captain Erdem didn't abort his takeoff. It was raining that night. Perhaps he was worried that he wouldn't be able to stop his speeding plane in time.
Procedurally, he's required to stop, but high-speed aborted takeoffs are something that are very serious, and that flight crews train to avoid high-speed aborted takeoffs if possible.
And we certainly looked at the parameters of the runway to ensure that there was adequate runway in that particular situation.
Careful measurements are taken. Investigators conclude that at 80 knots, when he first noticed the problem, Captain Erdem had enough runway left to bring his plane to a stop. He could have aborted his takeoff. There's also the question of the hastily assembled crew. Investigators now wonder if the last-minute nature of the crew's call could have influenced their decision to take off.
Birgenair started with a crew that probably didn't expect to fly that night. They didn't have adequate rest. They got out to the aircraft and perhaps were rushed in some of their planning.
Investigators consider the possibility that the crew, who had been away from home for more than 2 weeks, was simply too eager to get home.
08301, thank you. A good flight. Good flight. Good flight.
Y ahí viene el factor del homesick, la
This is the
enfermedad de
homesick
regreso a
factor,
casa,
where minor
donde
problems are
los problemas
ignored in order to
menores
get back
son
home.
obviados para seguir el vuelo y llegar a la casa.
Investigators will never know what was going through Captain Erdem's mind when he opted to continue his takeoff.
In this case, the airplane is accelerating rapidly enough. The first officer responds,
V1.
which is the commit to fly speed, and by training, now the decision window has closed. They need to fly.
Rotate.
And immediately thereafter, they're airborne.
Once the plane was in the air, its blocked pitot tubes caused Captain Erdem to make a series of critical mistakes. But how were the tubes blocked in the first place? Investigators will find that the deaths of 189 people was caused by something the size of a paperclip. Investigators now know that a blocked pitot tube led to a series of conflicting warnings that confounded Flight 301's captain. Now they want to know how those same warnings would affect other pilots.
Fuimos a un simulador de vuelo.
We went to a flight simulator,
and
in the
tratamos de
simulator, we tried to recreate the
la misma
conditions of what
situación que
happened
se
on the
dio
night of February 6th,
aquella noche del 6 de febrero de 1996.
Gentlemen, stand by.
The simulator showed investigators that an overspeed warning, followed by a stick shaker warning, caused even the most seasoned pilots to freeze. The contradictory warnings were potentially dangerous.
When the stick shaker activated, it was very unnerving. It's really overwhelming.
That would tell me that Mach airspeed warning horn, combined with a stick shaker, was a tremendously mind-boggling experience to a line pilot.
As a result, the FAA issues a directive that simulator training for all airline pilots must include a blocked pitot tube scenario.
The flight crew within Birgenair was faced with a large number of warnings that kept coming, and each warning added complexity to the environment. There's a lot of warning lights going off. This captain is in a condition that is deteriorating now very rapidly. So there is a dramatically increased demand on the captain to fly the airplane.
The FAA asks Boeing to change some of those warnings. Those changes include the addition of a new warning, which tells both pilots that their instruments disagree, and the ability for pilots to more easily silence troublesome alarms. Finally, Boeing modifies its planes so that pilots can easily choose which pitot tube the autopilot is using for airspeed readings. All told, more than 1,400 Boeing planes worldwide are affected by the new directives. One final question remains. What had blocked the plane's pitot tubes? Investigators conduct an extensive search for Birgenair Flight 301's pitot tubes. They are never found. But at Puerto Plata's airport, they don't have to look far to find the likeliest suspect. It's not ice, and it's not dirt.
We know that the area around Puerto Plata has a lot of bees and wasps and animals and birds and insects that like to build nests.
One of the insects is well known to pilots flying out of the Dominican Republic. It's called the mud dauber wasp. Bug experts tell investigators about an extraordinary connection between the wasps and a pitot tube.
Cuando la avipa albañilera está buscando un área para construir su nido, está buscando por un sitio, un lugar más o menos que tenga algo tubular. Cuando las avispas albañileras construyen sus nidos de barro, el barro cuando se seca o la arcilla se endurece y se compacta, es dura.
Mud dauber wasps are squatters that make their nests in available places, like crevices in homes, or even the pitot tubes of planes.
La razón del que el avión estuviera tanto día parado en el aeropuerto, 25 días, es suficiente tiempo para cualquier especie de las avispas albañileras construir su nido en los pitot tubes.
Investigators can only conclude that mud dauber wasps blocked the uncovered pitot tubes that fed the captain's airspeed indicator, which caused it to malfunction.
They didn't put covers on the pitot tubes. So at some point in time, extended time, there was an opportunity to get something like a mud dauber in that pitot tube.
Investigators have their answer. On February the 6th, 1996, a tiny insect led to a series of mistakes that brought down an airplane and changed the design of the world's most successful series of airliners. Morning rush hour, Charlotte, North Carolina. Its busy airport is rocked by a massive explosion.
The flames were coming over the fence, just total craziness. Everybody was just running for their lives.
Firefighters rush to one of the airport's main hangars. They confront an inferno.
It was quite a while before we realized a plane had hit the hangar.
A packed commuter flight has plunged to the ground shortly after takeoff. Everyone on board is killed.
We kept scratching our head wondering, okay, this airplane flew 9 times previously and we had no problems.
Investigators uncover a string of errors.
Bill, I have an idea.
And learn that passengers on small planes have actually been in danger for years. It's morning on January the 8th, 2003, in Charlotte, North Carolina. A city of 500,000 wakes. At Charlotte Douglas International Airport, commercial airline pilot Captain Katie Leslie is at work early. Only 25 years old, this Texas native has been flying for Air Midwest for almost 3 years. One of the youngest flight captains at her airline.
Hey, Tom. Have a great flight.
She's a top-rated pilot building her career at one of the fastest-growing airports in the United States. This airport is an important domestic hub for U.S. Airways, with flights to most major cities in the eastern United States. Air Midwest runs a commuter service as U.S. Airways Express. It operates a fleet of Beechcraft 1900D planes, a 19-passenger short-haul commuter plane, and a trusted workhorse in the industry. Today, Captain Leslie is in command of a 1900D on a 30-minute hop to Greenville-Spartanburg Airport in Greer, North Carolina. Her co-pilot is 27-year-old Jonathan Gibbs.
How'd you sleep last night?
Had a dream I was in Miami.
Attention, ladies and gentlemen, this is the final boarding call for Air Midwest Flight 5481 to Greenville-Spartanburg. All passengers wishing to board should make their way to gate.
Among the passengers flying to Greer this morning, 18-year-old Christiana Shepard. Christiana's parents, Doug and Teresa, are Baptist missionaries working in the Portuguese Azores.
Christiana left the 7th of January from the Azores, spent the night in the airport in Boston, and then flew the next morning on the early flight from Boston to Charlotte to Greenville. So she was on her way back to college.
Christiana was very special, and she was one that would come up and give you a hug and say, you know, she'd come for no reason. She would give you a hug and say, Dad, I love you.
At 8 in the morning, Christiana boards her flight. Meanwhile, as part of their standard checklist before takeoff, the crew calculates the weight of all the baggage, passengers, and fuel on the plane. That's to make sure the plane isn't overweight, and the weight is spread evenly. It's a calculation that's made on all commercial aircraft.
So we got a full house back there?
You can count 19 people in the back.
Don't know the bags yet.
Okay.
But baggage handlers raise concerns that the luggage they're loading may be too heavy.
Damn. Captain, how many we gotta take off?
We're figuring it out.
We don't think we're gonna have to take anything off.
Cool. 17,018.
17,120 is our weight, huh?
Yeah, is our max.
So, we're cool.
So, yeah.
Good morning. Welcome aboard U.S. Airways Express service to Greenville, Spartanburg. It's a very short flight, maybe 30 minutes gate to gate, so sit back, relax, and we'll have you there in a few minutes.
Before takeoff, the crew checks the flight controls, including the rudder and elevator, which help control the direction of the plane.
Flight controls, free and correct.
Air Midwest 5481, runway 18 right.
Taxi into position and hold.
Captain Leslie is moments from takeoff. On the runway ahead of them is a Bombardier CRJ ready for departure.
That CRJ sure is a good-looking plane, isn't it?
Yeah, wish I was flying it.
With powerful turbulence released from the CRJ, Captain Leslie must keep a safe distance.
They're gonna blast us with his jet blasts.
Air Midwest 5481, turn right heading 230. Cleared for takeoff.
Set takeoff power, please.
Power is set. 80 knots, cross-checked.
At 80 knots, pilots check that key instruments are working. With no signs of trouble, Leslie and Gibbs proceed with their takeoff. To air traffic control, Flight 5481's takeoff roll is perfectly normal.
Gear up.
What?
But without warning, the plane's nose pitches dramatically upward from 7 to a staggering 54 degrees.
Oh, help me! You got it?
The crew struggles to get the nose back down again. Airflow over the top of the wings creates lift. But if the nose keeps rising, air won't flow smoothly over the plane's wings. The plane will lose its lift, stall, and plunge from the sky.
Push the nose down! Oh my God! We have an emergency on Air Midwest 5481.
Alert 3 standby, runway 18 right.
The controller handling Flight 5481 calls for emergency equipment.
Oh my God.
The plane is now 350 meters from the ground. It stalls, rolls to the left, and begins falling from the sky. Captain Leslie pulls on her control column with all her might. If she can't get the plane to climb, she's going to hit the ground. Air traffic controllers watch as a 19-passenger plane plunges towards the Earth. Captain Katie Leslie struggles desperately to get her plane to climb, but it won't respond. The plane heads towards a packed U.S. Airways hangar. The flight was loaded with almost 1,000 kilograms of highly flammable jet fuel just before takeoff. The impact instantly ignites all that fuel. Now the intense fire threatens to engulf the hangar. There are several airplanes and hundreds of people working inside.
Fire station, no. Emergency? Engine crash. Is the plane that's crashed? Yes. At the U.S. Air Maintenance Parade, right at the door of the building, there's a fire. Cool, 10, here's crash.
38-year-old Fire Chief Keith Rogers is driving to work when he gets a Code 10 call.
Code 10 means that there's a confirmed plane crash. Usually, this type of call is a once-in-a-career type of incident.
Cindy Overcash is a firefighter with the Charlotte Fire Department.
You couldn't actually see the hangar from here, but you just saw a huge black plume of smoke. And we knew, something really bad is here.
In the adjacent building, sales director David Isola hears the explosion.
Well, I was sitting at my desk, and I heard this loud boom. And one of the guys came in from next door and said that he just saw an airplane crash. And so I hopped in my truck and drove down to the site.
From 60 meters away, Isola records the opening moments of the tragedy.
There was a lot of smoke, and it was just like hell. It looked just like hell. The flames were coming over the fence, just total craziness. Everybody was just running for their lives.
When Chief Keith Rogers arrives at the scene, he finds himself swimming upstream against a mob in panic.
As I got onto the airport property and got onto the tarmac, the people were exiting the hangar. Those people were running out in front of the fire trucks, the fire cars, so we had to drive with caution. They were getting out of the building as fast as they could, because I think they definitely realized that this was not a drill, this was a real emergency.
And we still weren't sure if we had a plane inside the hangar that had caught on fire, or if the hangar had caught on fire. It was quite a while before we realized a plane had hit the hangar.
Chief Rogers immediately takes command of the scene. He knows that there are aircraft parked inside the flaming hangar. Their fuel tanks threaten to blow.
And our concern was, one, about the people that were on board the aircraft, two, for the people that were working in the hangar, and three, we had to worry about the airplanes that were in for repair were those aircraft on fire. So we had a lot of major issues to deal with.
Within minutes, firefighters begin to get the inferno under control. The hope now is that somewhere inside the wreck, survivors are clinging to life.
The main thing probably was on anybody's mind once we realized what we had was survivors.
Chief Rogers sends a line of firefighters led by Cindy Overcash into the heart of the inferno. Cindy Overcash and two of her team make their way into the wreckage, carefully putting out spot fires along the way.
As we walk up on to see the fire and we see what we think are crash test dummies, we thought a plane had blown up inside and blew their training dummies out. And then it dawned on me. That's not a training dummy.
It took them a few minutes to determine exactly what was happening, and once they did that, it was obvious that there were no survivors.
It's a total loss. All 19 passengers, as well as Captain Leslie and First Officer Gibbs, are dead.
At about 8:53 this morning, we had an aircraft accident. It had 19 passengers and 2 crew. There are no survivors.
And we hope that we never have to respond to a situation with such a large loss of life, but that is our job. This is some of the most difficult duty and tasks that a firefighter will ever do in their career.
For medics and rescue workers, the ordeal is over. But for friends and family of the victims, the anguish has just begun.
I was walking through the living room, and I stopped and said, my heart's beating right now just the way it was then. Said, has Christiana called yet? She said, no. Okay, and I knew then what had happened. I knew. So I went and got the telephone and called the school. He said, yes, Mrs. Shepard, we have some sad news. And he told me that the plane had crashed on takeoff. I asked if there were any survivors. He said no. So then I knew I had to go tell Doug, and he was in the garage.
Yeah, it's something you never forget about. I was changing a fluorescent bulb, and Teresa came to the doorway.
How do you say that? You use words every single day. How can you use words to ruin someone's life? But I told him, I said, Doug, Christiana's plane crashed.
At that moment, my world fell apart.
Now the Shepards and the families of the other 20 victims want to know what caused the deaths of their loved ones. It's been almost 5 hours since Flight 5481 crashed into a hangar in Charlotte, North Carolina. With no survivors to rescue, neither bodies nor airplane parts are moved from where they fell until the arrival of investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board. While medical examiners mark the location of human remains in red, NTSB investigators mark scraps of metal in yellow, looking for clues to help them figure out what happened aboard Flight 5481. Among those assigned to this case, lead investigator Lorinda Ward. This is her first assignment as the lead investigator of a crash. But today, she's not feeling her best.
That day, I was a little bit under the weather. I was fighting off a cold. You have the adrenaline that shoots through your body at the time, and so that actually makes up for when you're not feeling well. And I knew that the other people on my team were experienced, so I felt comfortable going to Charlotte.
At Charlotte Douglas Airport, Ward takes the first steps towards solving this accident.
I checked in with the fire department to make sure that the fires had been put out, and then called a meeting with all the first responders to see what they had noticed when they came to the crash site.
Ward acts fast. Because there are bodies entangled with the wreckage, she declares the crash site a potential biohazard. Investigators who might come in contact with the wreckage must wear protective suits while they examine the wreck and identify the victims' remains.
When we arrived on scene, the accident site did not look like an airplane was there. Due to the fire, the post-crash fire, when you initially walked up to it, it was hard to identify that you had an airplane that could hold 21 people.
While work continues at the crash site,
All right, let's go.
Lorinda Ward and her team look for clues nearby.
We had the folks go shoulder to shoulder on the runway that the accident crew took off on to pick up anything that they saw on the runway to see if it had any relevance to the accident investigation.
Runways must be clear of all debris. The smallest object can become a deadly projectile if it strikes a plane on takeoff. 3 years earlier, a Concorde jet ran over a 40-centimeter strip of scrap metal on a Paris runway. The plane's fuel tank was pierced and caught fire. The aircraft rose to 200 meters before it crashed into a nearby hotel. 109 people on board and 4 people on the ground were killed. At Charlotte Douglas International, investigators scour the area. They find a fuel cap lying dangerously close to the runway.
What we got?
It could be sucked in and it could damage an engine. The main part would be the damage that it could do to an engine.
The discovery raises an interesting possibility. As Flight 5481 raced down the runway at takeoff, the fuel cap bounced up off the tarmac, struck the engine rotors, and brought Captain Leslie's aircraft crashing to Earth.
This was to be brought back to see if it had any relevance to the accident investigation, whether it came off the airplane itself or if it could have done some type of damage to the airplane.
A closer examination leads Ward and her team to conclude that the fuel cap could not have interfered with the propellers. Investigators discover no other relevant debris on the runway. The runway debris theory is ruled out. Now, NTSB air traffic control investigator Bill English explores another scenario.
When we first heard about the accident, it looked like there might be the possibility that we'd want to look at a wake turbulence encounter.
The wings of a fast-moving jet disturb the air around them, creating a trail of violently swirling air. NASA tests decades earlier had illustrated the power and danger of wake turbulence to other planes.
We had to see, did another airplane depart before it? That's where wake turbulence hazard would come from. And we wanted to look at what kind of airplane departed ahead of it. Larger, heavier airplanes are the more risky wake turbulence creating airplanes.
Bill English examines radar records from the time of the accident. He learns that a much heavier Bombardier regional jet, a CRJ, took off moments before the beach.
The CRJ sure is a good-looking plane, isn't it?
Yeah, wish I was flying it.
The wake turbulence is generated from the wingtips of any airplane. As soon as it starts to lift off the ground, it makes what people sometimes call horizontal tornadoes, vortexes of air that can create hazardous turbulence.
Runway 18 right.
Taxi into position.
Air traffic controllers do have standard procedures for spacing out airplanes so that they have a chance to avoid the wake turbulence or let the wake dissipate.
1 year earlier, an American Airlines jet taking off from New York encountered wake turbulence. The plane crashed into a residential neighborhood. 260 people on the plane and 5 people on the ground were killed.
You're gonna blast us with his jet blasts.
Air Midwest 5481.
Cleared for takeoff.
Air traffic investigator Bill English must now determine if wake turbulence from the CRJ caused Flight 5481 to crash. Bill English studies the flight path of Captain Leslie's plane and finds it consistent with a plane flying into wake turbulence.
A pitch up is not unheard of in a wake turbulence encounter where the airplane will suddenly go nose up and the crew has trouble to counter that and get the nose back where it belongs.
English needs to know how close the Air Midwest flight got to the larger jet. The Charlotte Tower has a sophisticated computer system that tracks the movement of planes while they're still on the ground. The system gave Bill English his answer.
That system had a very rapid update, so we could see exactly where on the runway and at what time the regional jet lifted off compared to when the accident airplane started its roll.
When Bill English plots the precise position of the planes at liftoff, he makes a telling discovery. Even though both planes used the same runway, their paths never crossed.
The RJ started lifting off much farther down the runway than the accident airplane did, and the climb-out angle of the regional jet and the climb-out angle of the accident airplane never intersected. The angle of the accident airplane was very steep. It really had no possibility of intersecting the wake turbulence from the regional jet. So if our airplane lifted off and climbed above the angle of the previous airplane, we knew then that it couldn't possibly be a factor.
The wake vortex theory is ruled out, and Bill English's work is done. Now it's up to Ward and her crew to find clues in the burnt-out wreckage of the plane. Within 2 days, her investigation will reveal a string of errors and faulty assumptions that has been putting tens of thousands of passengers at risk for years. Within hours of the crash, investigators find the cockpit voice recorder and flight data recorder from Air Midwest Flight 5481. The recorders are designed to withstand temperatures of up to 1100 degrees Celsius. In this crash, parts of the voice recorder had actually melted. The devices are photographed and sent for analysis. Then, amongst the tons of debris on the ground, investigators discover the shredded remains of the elevator control cables. Vital to flight control, these cables link the pilot's control columns to the flight elevator, an aerodynamic panel that helps pilots climb and descend. Turnbuckles keep the cables taut. To climb, pilots pull on the column. The cables pull the elevator up, forcing the nose to rise. To descend, pilots push on the control column. The cables tilt the elevator down, and the nose falls. But as investigators examine the burnt-out cables and turnbuckles on Captain Leslie's plane, already something looks wrong.
They looked unusual. They weren't in like the normal position that you would find them. In this case, we had one adjusted all the way out, and then one adjusted all the way in. So those were set aside for us to look at later.
While the lab work continues, NTSB investigator Stephen Carbone travels to Huntington, Virginia. He interviews mechanics who worked on the plane the day before the crash.
It's all there. At the time, we had known that it had just come out of a detail check, which is a routine check. And knowing that, we were looking into the possibility that something had been done during the check that needed to be looked at from an investigation point of view.
The cables needed servicing. My guy wrote up a service order, and I put him on it. Don't forget the manual.
Got it.
Every 1,200 flight hours, Air Midwest planes go in for routine maintenance work. This includes adjusting the cables that control the plane's elevator.
In the process of doing this check, he found that the mechanic had found that the cables were out of limits. So he had written up that he was going to check the cable tensions and then adjust them as per the manual.
Everything's ready?
The mechanics tell Carbone that the work was checked and stamped for quality assurance.
They believe that the aircraft was properly rigged as per the manual.
At first glance, that belief appears to be right. After maintenance, this Beech aircraft took off and landed 9 times without incident before Captain Leslie took the helm. Investigators turned to the flight data recorder to learn what happened on those flights. The flight data recorder stores data from numerous flights, both before and after the plane's cables were adjusted. No one on any of those flights had encountered any problems with the plane's elevator.
So at the time, we didn't know how that affected the airplane because it had flown 9 times successfully before the accident flight.
Ward also discovers that the crew tested their elevator controls before Flight 5481 took off.
Flight controls, free and correct.
Air Midwest 5481.
Ward and her team dig deeper, looking to discover if the unusual configuration of the elevator cables could have played a role in this crash. What they find strikes at the very heart of what went wrong. Normally, both turnbuckles are almost exactly the same length. But on Captain Leslie's plane, one turnbuckle is noticeably longer than the other. To establish the correct cable tension, mechanics tighten the turnbuckles. But too much tightening of a turnbuckle shortens the cables and cuts the range of motion of the elevator control. The elevator should be able to tilt to a nose-down position of 14 degrees. But their downward range has actually been cut in half to only 7 degrees. The result is deadly. As the flight got underway, the nose pitched up as expected during takeoff.
What?
Push the nose down! Oh my God!
But the reduced range in the elevator made it impossible for the pilots to bring the nose down again.
Due to the adjustment that had been done in the maintenance a few nights earlier, there was nothing that the crew could have done at that time.
Unable to bring the nose down, the pitch of the wings became too pronounced. With no air flowing over the top of the wings, the plane lost its lift and began falling from the sky. The pilot's struggle with the elevator helps explain why Flight 5481 crashed that day. Somehow, the elevator cables were improperly adjusted. The pilots simply could not control the pitch of their airplane. Stephen Carbone wants to know how mechanics had made such a critical mistake.
Yeah, I see that here.
He goes back to the hangar to question the mechanics on duty that night. And this time they tell him a different story.
Most of the guys were just learning the ropes.
The mechanics working on the airline were subcontractors to the contract company. And the mechanics working on the aircraft that night had limited experience on the Beech 1900D. And the person performing the rig was receiving training that night on that specific task.
Once you have the rig pin set, adjust the turnbuckle barrels for more tension in the cable.
Yeah, I see that here.
Adjusting the elevator cables is not a simple process. It's a time-consuming procedure that involves 25 different steps.
Got it. What about the other steps?
Yeah, don't worry about those. Just check the cable tension when you're done, and we're good. That's it.
The quality assurance inspector and the mechanic took it upon themselves to decide which steps to perform because they felt that the steps they were performing were the only ones necessary to get the task done.
The mechanic skipped 9 steps that night. One of those involved manipulating the elevator through its full range of motion. Had the mechanic tried to do that, he would have noticed that the elevator's motion was restricted by cables that had been improperly rigged.
If they had followed the steps as described in the manual, they would have found the problems that had come up.
But there was an inspector supervising the work. Carbone discovers that the inspector was actually the person teaching the mechanics how to do the work.
The problem was that the quality assurance inspector was actually acting as an instructor. So he was taking the mechanic through the process of the job task and teaching him how to do the rig. Well, when you put yourself in that position, you're actually doing the task because even as a teacher, you're performing the task. And then he came in behind himself and then signed off as an inspector what he had done.
When I found out that this mechanic had skipped procedures, I was upset. The procedures that affected our lives, that affected the lives of 21 people, 21 families were destroyed. Because you never get over something like this.
The Shepherds sue the airline. They also demand something unheard of in US aviation, an apology.
They wanted more than just to achieve a just settlement in monetary terms. They had a need to press the issues that humanize and put a face on the people who are the victims of these tragedies.
The Shepherds believe that their best chance of getting an apology is by putting a face to Christiana's name.
So we decided to take this picture and to send it to those people that were involved in the accident, in the investigation, so that Christiana would not be just a number or a seat number or a ticket number or a settlement amount, so that they could actually see that she was a person.
The legal journey began when we determined that we wanted the apology, that we wanted someone to say, we really blew this. We assumed the airline would apologize. We had no idea that airlines don't apologize. If they did something wrong, obviously you should stand up and say, we are so sorry that we messed up in this and we're fixing this.
In this case, the mechanics thought they were doing something that was perfectly reasonable. They thought this was, another day at the job. And then to come to find out that now 21 people have been, killed due to their inadvertent act.
For Lorinda Ward and her team, it looks like they've found the problem. But something still doesn't add up. Why didn't the problem with the plane's faulty rigging surface on any of its previous flights?
We kept scratching our head wondering, okay, this airplane flew 9 times previously and we had no problems. So we're trying to decide, well, what was unusual about this flight?
Ward has to figure out what happened in the hours and minutes before the crash.
And did you notice anything unusual before takeoff?
Well, it was sitting low when it taxied out. It looked heavy.
We had a couple of witnesses that were implying that we had a very heavily loaded airplane. The baggage people said that it was hard to shut the door because they thought bags were going to come out.
Each plane has a maximum weight it can handle before the engines can't get it off the ground. Before takeoff, it's the pilot's job to calculate the onboard weight.
We got a full house back there?
How many we gotta take off?
We're figuring it out.
The crew of Flight 5481 did perform that calculation.
Cool, 17018.
We heard them on the CVR going through the numbers to make sure that they'd have their center of gravity within the range for them to take off.
17120 is our weight, huh?
Yeah, as our max.
On any plane, large or small, the weight of cargo and passengers has to be distributed evenly. The balancing point of an airplane is called its center of gravity. For a plane to fly safely, it can neither be too far forward nor too far back or aft.
So, we're cool.
So, yeah.
We don't think we're gonna have to take anything off.
Air Midwest pilots are instructed how to make weight and center of gravity, or CG, calculations. They use average weights to make that calculation, 175 pounds per passenger and 20 pounds per bag.
They knew that they had a very aft CG, but due to using the average weights and average calculations, the paperwork showed them being within the range that they needed to take off.
But Ward needs to know if the plane really was within the proper range of weight and balance to take off.
But what we did is we looked at the weights of the actual baggage itself that was on board and then the weight of the passengers and the crew.
Technicians weigh the remains of the burnt luggage from the wreckage site.
Doctor, yes, could you tell me, please, what the last recorded weight of your patient is, please?
And obtain the real weight of passengers on board that day.
212. Thank you.
When all the numbers are in, Ward discovers the real weight of Flight 5481 is 17,700 pounds. some 580 pounds over its maximum takeoff weight.
They would not have been able to take off if they had used actual weights. They would have had to pull either passengers or bags off.
Because of the higher than expected weight of the passengers and baggage on the flight, and the large number of bags stowed in the rear, the airplane was tail heavy. Its center of gravity ever so slightly too far to the rear, which wasn't a problem until the landing gear was raised.
Gear up.
When the gear's weight moved backwards from the nose, it tipped the balance of weight too far back. The pilot's efforts to regain control of the aircraft were futile, crippled by the airplane's defective elevator controls.
When the nose gear moved aft, they lost the ability to control the aircraft because all the weight went back and they had no elevator movement enough to bring the nose back down. And at the height that they were at, they had no recovery.
The passengers and crew of Flight 5481 were doomed the moment the plane left the ground. They had no way of knowing that two unrelated problems would combine to bring down their plane.
This was just a normal routine flight for them, and they did all the pre-flight checks, they did their weight and balance, they did the correct calls, they're on the right runway. It was just another day at the job, and they didn't know that they had these two hidden, latent failures that were waiting for them.
But faulty maintenance and above-average weights weren't the only issues uncovered by Lorinda Ward's investigation.
Hey, you got a sec? I have an idea.
Lorinda Ward suspects she's uncovered problems that didn't just affect this one flight, but that also affected every commuter plane in the air. NTSB investigators say that every plane crash makes flying safer. Flight 5481 was no exception. 14 months after the accident, lead investigator Lorinda Ward and her team file a comprehensive report to ensure the mistakes that killed those aboard Flight 5481 are never repeated. Among Ward's recommendations, that the FAA review its average passenger and baggage weights, an average that had not been revised since 1936. And since studies suggest that Americans and other adults were getting heavier from year to year, Ward suspected that the averages were off.
We made a recommendation to the FAA to have the operators go out and survey their operations both summer and winter time to see how accurate these average weights reflected the actual flying public that was getting onto their airplanes.
After conducting a survey of passengers, the FAA comes to a shocking conclusion. The average weight of adult American passengers was 195 pounds, not 175. The FAA also discovered that the average weight of carry-on luggage was being underestimated by 5 pounds per bag.
We had an average weight that were being used that needed to be updated.
Had these higher average weights been in effect on January the 8th, 2003, Flight 5481 would not have been legal for takeoff. Captain Leslie would have had to remove bags and passengers.
48107. Cool. 17018.
Air Midwest pilots now use an average weight of 200 pounds per passenger, which means that their Beechcraft planes can only carry 17 passengers, not 19. But Ward's report goes on to say that even with updated industry averages, there's still room for error. Her report states that flying small aircraft will be safest only when airlines stop using average weight assumptions altogether and calculate the real weight on board before takeoff. New technologies are being developed to allow air carriers to measure actual weight and control balance in real time as the plane is loaded. Knowing the actual weight of passengers and baggage is vital. More and more people are flying on small commuter jets. As the cost of jet fuel soars, the smaller, fuel-efficient planes become more attractive to airlines. In the United States alone, more than 10 million people a year board planes with fewer than 30 seats.
Smaller aircraft are more sensitive to the weight and balance issue than, say, a larger airplane.
In spite of Ward's recommendations and the available technology, almost 70% of small planes on scheduled flights still use average instead of actual weights. For Doug and Teresa Shepard, there is still another danger that threatens to strike again.
If the FAA took a very active role in their regulation, then subcontracting could actually be a plus. The way it's handled today, the mistakes will just continue.
What about the other steps?
Yeah, don't worry about those. Just check the cable tension when you're done, and we're good.
In her report, Ward states that all air carriers need to provide direct oversight to make sure that even subcontracted work is completed correctly.
This investigation was unique to me personally because it was my first launch as an investigator in charge. This was, in my mind, a significant investigation in the fact that we had the 22 safety recommendations that came out from a small accident investigation.
For the Shepards, the NTSB recommendations come too late. But after a lengthy legal battle, Air Midwest does deliver a rare and formal apology for the mistakes that cost 18-year-old Christiana Shepard her life.
My name is Ron Goldman, and my role here today is I will be introducing the public apology, and then I'll have a few words. The public apology is, in aviation cases, unprecedented.
We are here today to remember the victims of Flight 5481 and to offer our apologies, our condolences, and sincere sympathy to the surviving family members of the passengers and crew who perished in the January 8, 2003 crash of Air Midwest Flight number 5481.
The acceptance of accountability suggests that the recommendations made by the safety investigators are not to be taken as a book to throw in a drawer and forget about, but are to be taken seriously, because if you don't take them seriously, there's going to be public accountability as well as private accountability.
What people should never forget is that as we're going about and doing our job day to day, we need to remember the importance of doing our job. Doesn't matter where we're at on the ladder or the corporate ladder, whether we're at the bottom rung or the top rung, we have responsibilities.
It took a complicated string of errors and miscalculations to bring down Flight 5481. But some believe there was one person who performed admirably that day, Captain Katie Leslie. With an unbalanced plane and faulty controls, Captain Leslie could not have saved the flight. But her final actions may have saved some lives.
You know, she's an unsung hero to me because I don't think many people know about what she did and how she was fighting it and trying to pull the plane away from the hangar. And she actually did. She kept it from really more of a head-on hit into the hangar. Which probably saved countless other people from perishing that day.
It was firefighter Cindy Overcash who found the body of Captain Katie Leslie among the wreckage. To this day, Overcash still feels a special connection to the young pilot.
I don't know, I just felt a kinship. I don't know why. I don't know, you know, it could be as simple as I found her. And I was there when she left this world. I don't know, but I thought about her a lot.
Lorinda Ward's investigation could have ended when she uncovered the errors that caused the crash of Flight 5481. By digging a bit deeper, she made flying safer for millions of people. a routine landing.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are starting our approach to the FW.
Turns into a sudden fight to the death.
You're gonna lose it all of a sudden. There it is.
A passenger jet mysteriously falls from the sky and rockets towards a busy highway.
Push it up. Push it way up. Delta, go around. It's gonna crash.
A mysterious force brings down a plane claiming 137 lives. In the wreckage lies the one clue that can stop it from killing again. August the 2nd, 1985. Dallas, Texas. It's a very hot day, even by Texas standards.
See y'all tomorrow.
Temperatures soar to 101 degrees.
Rain coming. Should cool things down a bit.
In the late afternoon, William Maybury is heading home from work. The day's heat and humidity are having an effect on traffic at Dallas-Fort Worth International Airport, DFW. Roughly the size of Manhattan, DFW is the biggest airport in the world. It's also one of the busiest. The heat has triggered some afternoon thunderstorms at the airport, creating a backlog of planes waiting to take off.
American 631, you are cleared for takeoff.
Air traffic controller Gene Skipworth is in the tower today. He's been working there for 14 years. With him is controller Mike Porter.
Skipworth was not asking for help. Nothing seemed unusual other than the fact that we were starting to get busy and aircraft were starting to pile up.
One of the many planes heading towards Skipworth's control is Delta Airlines Flight 191.
Weather 6,000 scattered to 1,000 scattered. Visibility 10, temperature 101, wind calm.
101?
101 degrees, yes, sir.
Captain Ed Connors and First Officer Rudy Price are two of Delta Airlines' most experienced pilots. Second Officer Nick Nassick is the other member of today's crew. The crew is flying a 6-year-old L-1011 TriStar. The L-1011 is billed as one of the safest planes in the sky. There are 152 passengers and 11 crew members on board. They're scheduled to land in Dallas just before 6 in the evening.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. This is your captain speaking. Hope you're enjoying your flight so far. Traffic is backing up at Dallas. All told, we'll be about 10 to 15 minutes late getting to the gate. Please let us know if there's anything we can do to make your flight more comfortable.
The delay bothers Chris Meyer. He's a frequent business traveler who's in a hurry to get home to his family for the weekend.
I've been down in Florida, Fort Lauderdale, for the last 2 weeks, and it was a Friday afternoon, and I was due to go home on Flight 191.
One of IBM's best-known executives is also on the flight. Don Estridge led the development of the IBM PC. He and his wife are traveling to Dallas for a family visit.
"963, turn right, heading 620.
En route from Florida to Texas, Delta 191 will be in communication with several controllers.
Turn you into Blue Ridge, it'll be about 0.
Every aircraft is guided along its flight path by a series of regional air route traffic control centers. They direct each plane's speed and altitude.
1901, descend and maintain 10,000. Join the Blue Ridge 010 radial and inbound. We have a good area there to go through.
Captain Connors has some concerns about the route he's been given. He sees a storm cell along that path, and he doesn't want to fly through it.
Well, I'm looking at a cell at about a heading of 255. It's a pretty good sized cell. I'd rather not go through it. I'd rather go around it one way or the other.
I've had about 60 aircraft go through this area out here, 10 to 12 miles wide. They're getting a good ride, no problem.
Well, I can see a cell now about heading 240.
When I can, I'll turn you into Blue Ridge. It'll be about the 010 radial.
010, roger. We're going to hold you to that.
Captain Connors gets his way. He's given permission to fly around the storm. Once past it, he'll line up for a landing on runway 17 left.
I'm glad we didn't have to go through that.
Friday afternoons are a busy time at airports. The afternoon rain is making this Friday even busier.
23-9er down to 618.96.
The main priority for the controller on duty is to keep the incoming planes a safe distance apart. He wants them at least 4.5 kilometers from each other. That distance allows enough time for the violent air turbulence behind one plane to die down before the next plane touches down. Right now, Connors and Price are getting too close to the plane just ahead of them, a corporate Learjet.
Delta 191 heavy. Turn left 10 degrees, reduce speed to 180.
To put some distance between the two planes, the controller asks the Delta crew to slow to 180 knots.
Delta 191.
330 kilometers an hour.
Wilco.
10-degree flaps, please.
You're listening to Dallas 105 FM. It's a wet one out there, folks, so drive careful.
Heading home along Highway 114, William Maybury will soon be passing DFW. Flight 191 is now just 50 kilometers from the foot of the runway.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are starting our approach to DFW. Please make sure your seats are in the upright position and your seatbelts are securely fastened.
The crew begins their final descent into the Dallas-Fort Worth area.
Attention all aircraft listening. There's a little rain shower just north of the airport.
Connors now switches radio frequencies and contacts a local DFW airport traffic controller for approach instructions. As the passengers and crew of Flight 191 prepare for their landing, a deadly force takes shape in their path. Critical decisions and missed information conspire against them. The crew will soon be engaged in a 47-second struggle, which will become one of the most important moments in the history of modern aviation. August the 2nd, 1985. The crew of Delta Airlines Flight 191 has been skirting a line of heavy storms between Florida and their destination, Texas. 30 kilometers from the Dallas-Fort Worth Airport, First Officer Rudy Price notices rain ahead.
We're gonna get our airplane washed.
What?
We're gonna get our airplane washed.
It seemed like the closer we got into DFW, the worse the weather got. And we was turning it into the rain instead of going around it. And the pilots never said anything about the bad weather.
Delta 191 is still closing in on the Learjet ahead of it. Price and Connors need to slow down even further to put some distance between the two planes.
Delta 191 heavy, reduce speed to 150.
Speed to 150.
9 kilometers from runway 17 left, Delta 191 is handed over to another controller, Gene Skipworth, for final approach and landing.
15. Tower, Delta 191 Heavy, out here in the rain. Feels good. Delta 191
Skipworth tells the crew to expect a manageable crosswind of up to 15 knots.
Winds 090 at 5, gusts to 15. Thank you, sir.
First Officer Price will be at the controls for the upcoming landing. Pilots and co-pilots routinely alternate flying duties. As Flight 191 is coming into land, William Maybury is just north of the airport. He's caught in the same storm that Price and Connors are just beginning to fly through.
Before landing check.
Landing gear. Down, 3 green. Flaps, slats. 33, 33, green lights.
The crew suddenly notices that they'll be flying into more than a bit of rain.
There's lightning coming out of that one.
What?
There's lightning coming out of that one.
Where?
Right ahead of us.
1,000 feet. I'll call them out to you.
All right.
We're not getting any bad warnings from the weather or from other pilots, which we rely on as they come through it. They need to report to us, and they do if they have turbulence or they have trouble on final or ran into anything abnormal.
The Learjet ahead of Flight 191 lands safely. Connors and Price are now less than a minute behind. Without warning, the intensity of the storm increases. The L-1011 is being pounded by a driving rain.
I knew we was getting ready to land, but at the same time, you felt the surge, like the pilot was revving up the engine for something.
The plane's airspeed is increasing for no apparent reason.
What's your speed?
Price pulls back on the throttles to slow the plane down and maintain it at the requested 150 knots. The plane is just 180 meters from the ground.
You're gonna lose it all of a sudden. There it is.
Then the plane drops rapidly. It's as though an invisible force is pushing it to the ground.
Push it up. Push it way up. Way up! Way up! Way up!
The crew is pushing the plane's jet engines to their full power, but can't get more speed or get the plane to climb.
So I pulled my seatbelt tight as I could, but at the same time, you could hear a pin drop. Nobody was talking. But I mean, it got dead silence.
As suddenly as it began, the crisis seems to end. The plane stops falling and begins to pick up some of the speed Connors and Price have been fighting for.
That's it.
But before the crew can take another breath, the plane drops again, rocking violently from side to side. And then it dips wildly to the right.
And I just knew we shouldn't be that close to the ground that soon.
Hang on to the son of a...
About 2 kilometers from the runway, it plows into a field and rockets towards Highway 114.
When we hit the ground, it felt like you was in a car running over railroad ties. It was real bumpy.
The crew somehow manages to get the plane back in the air. At that moment, Gene Skipworth catches sight of Delta 191.
He's gonna crash! Delta, go around!
But it's too late. The plane's engines slam into William Maybury's car on Highway 114. He is killed instantly. The plane hits the ground again, north of the runway. It's traveling more than 350 kilometers an hour.
I must have caught sight of him just at the last millisecond, and he cartwheeled into the tank in just an instant, and then, of course, there was fire, not a ball of fire, but a wall of fire.
It seemed like it was only a few seconds, 5 seconds at the most. I don't know how long it was. Everything was stopped.
The resulting explosion is so powerful that the rear section of the plane is blasted backwards, away from the fireball.
Then all of a sudden you look up and it's just nothing there. Everything's gone. You just see the whole big picture outside, like the plane just opened up.
Remarkably, the tail section containing the last 10 rows of seats is relatively intact.
People just thrown around on the ground. Some were clothes on, some without clothes on, some were burned. It was something that you can't describe unless you were there to see it. It is something that you will never get out of your mind.
Over here! Hang in there, help someone.
Then, as suddenly as it had started, the rain stops. It takes firefighters less than a minute to get to the crash.
And when I arrived on the scene, I truly believe that there wasn't anybody that had survived this plane crash because there was just devastation everywhere. What I had pulled up on at the time was the wing section, which is the portion of the aircraft that carries the fuel. So there was a large amount of fuel and a large amount of flames.
The front of the plane has all but disintegrated.
I knew I had to get out there. At the time, I was a stringer for Time magazine, worked with them on a part-time basis, called their Atlanta headquarters for this portion of the country. They said one word, go.
Firefighters need only a few minutes to get the raging fire under control. They then turn their attention to pulling survivors from the plane.
It wasn't until the fire started to subside a little bit that I saw the tail section where there was some hope of some people surviving. There were these two women that were walking through the smoke.
Ladies, clear the area! Get out of the way, clear the area!
And it kind of surprised me, so I knew that there was hope and that there were people out there.
Only 27 people survived the crash.
I had seen death before as a medic in Vietnam, but it had never been aimed at civilians, and certainly not on a mass casualty situation, and certainly not this suddenly. I could tell how bad it was. You could see and smell and feel the death.
We felt like we did everything that we could, and we were just pleased that there were survivors.
I was scheduled to sit on off seat 15A, and I told them that wouldn't be no good because that was a non-smoking section. I was a smoker, so I had to be in back. That probably saved my life.
Captain Connors, First Officer Price, and Second Officer Nassick are killed. So are 5 other crew members and 128 passengers. IBM's Don Estridge and his wife are among the dead.
In the tower, there was silence for probably 1 to 2 minutes, except for just an occasional transmission. But basically, it's just quiet, and you just sit there stunned and wishing you could do anything to take it back.
This is a monumental crash. Investigators from the National Transportation Safety Board arrive at DFW, determined to find the cause.
One of our field investigators would have been on scene trying to locate the flight data recorder and the cockpit voice recorder, which is, you know, a very important part of the investigation.
Investigators begin looking for evidence of mechanical failure. They examine the wreckage for clues that the plane was not responding to the pilot's command.
It's essential in any approach or departure accident to establish what the airplane's configuration was, to assure that it was not a factor in the accident, or everything was normal on this aircraft.
Investigators turn their attention away from the plane and to the skies.
After any accident in commercial aviation, there are theories galore. A couple of them prevalent that evening. First, that lightning had struck the airplane. Secondly, that it had been hit by a mini tornado.
There's lightning coming out of that one.
Where?
Right ahead of us.
15 different witnesses, including flight crews, report seeing lightning as Flight 191 was descending towards the runway. The investigators have to consider the possibility that Flight 191 was hit by lightning.
Lightning is always something that you have to investigate to determine the possibility that lightning disabled some part of the airplane.
In 1963, a Boeing 707 was struck by lightning. The lightning ignited the fuel in the plane's tank. The plane crashed. 81 people died. There had been a handful of similar crashes since then. Key pieces of wreckage from Flight 191 are taken to the NTSB lab in Washington, D.C. Bud Lehner is the investigator in charge of examining the wreckage, as well as the data from the plane's cockpit voice recorder.
But sometimes it might be very difficult to find to determine where the airplane might have been struck by lightning and where the exit point was.
Lightning coming out of that one. Where? Right ahead of us.
If the plane was hit by lightning, there would be evidence left behind. A device called a static discharge wick is attached to the trailing edge of an airplane's wings. It redirects static electricity into the outside air instead of into the plane, where the charge could cause a fire. If the plane was hit by lightning, one of the pieces that would be visibly damaged is the static discharge wick.
Nothing there.
With lightning ruled out, investigators go looking elsewhere. They would soon discover the real culprit. It had actually been caught on tape. A Delta Airlines L-1011 crashes after entering a storm near Dallas. "137 people die. Investigators rule out mechanical problems and lightning as causes of the crash.
Nothing there.
The NTSB's Bud Lehner turns his attention to the plane just ahead of Delta 191, the corporate Learjet. He learns that it was less than a minute ahead and flew through the very same storm.
After we had passed about 5 miles from the end of the runway, we entered a rain shower, what we thought was a light rain shower, and it turned out to be the heaviest rain I've ever seen before or since.
In spite of the rain, Rufus Lewis managed to land his plane safely on runway 17 left.
When we broke out of the clouds, we were high and hot. So we had to use all of the runway at DFW Airport. We landed, were able to turn off at the end of the runway.
So why was the much larger L-1011 unable to land just moments later?
Delta 191 Heavy, reduce speed to 15.
To put some distance between Delta 191 and the Lear jet, the controller had asked Price to slow his plane several times. When Lehner plots the bigger plane's speed,
then down to 150,
he finds that it was coming into land at 150 knots.
Delta 191 Heavy, reduce speed to 150.
Investigators consider the possibility that Flight 191 had been traveling too slowly for a safe landing.
If you don't have a lot of extra energy, you don't have anything to trade in case you get in trouble. A lot of times in adverse conditions, the pilots, they add another 10 knots for mom and the kids.
Crews don't have to follow a controller's speed request if they think it's unsafe. Price did reduce his speed. He knew this plane extremely well. He had actually helped to rewrite the L-1011's operating manual.
If the captain decided that 150 knots was too slow, they would have told the controller it was too slow and they wouldn't have flown it.
Lehner consults the airplane's manufacturer and interviews other L-1011 pilots. He concludes that neither the controller nor First Officer Price made any errors regarding speed.
Delta 191 Heavy, reduce speed to 150.
This plane should have been able to land at 150 knots.
Speed to 150.
Bud Lehner still doesn't know what slammed Flight 191 into the ground. But soon he finds the clues he needs on the plane's flight data recorder. It logs every adjustment pilots make to the plane's controls. The device also records external elements like temperature, wind speed, altitude, and air pressure. Whatever Connors and Price were fighting, there's a good chance it left its fingerprints on the flight data recorder.
This flight data recorder gave us several parameters we didn't have before. Engine power, longitudinal acceleration, and those kinds of parameters really enabled us to do a more in-depth analysis.
The plane's data recorder has documented a combination of rapidly shifting winds.
Then it shifts to a downdraft.
In a matter of seconds, the plane was hit with strong winds from the front, then from above, and then from behind.
There you have it.
For Bud Lehner, that sequence could only mean one thing: a microburst. A microburst is a violent shaft of air falling from a storm cloud. Back in 1985, few people knew more about encounters between microbursts and airplanes than John McCarthy.
If you're at the kitchen sink and you turn on the water and it goes straight down and it splashes out in all directions. And that's kind of what a microburst is, except that it is extremely bad news if you're an airplane flying through it at low altitude.
A plane first faces a strong headwind which lifts the plane skyward, then a downdraft which slams it towards the ground. Finally, the microburst delivers its most dangerous punch, the tailwind.
And you would get a rapid descent, a loss of lift, and a rapid descent towards the ground, and easily crash the airplane.
A plane's wings need a steady flow of air moving over them. That's what gives them their lift. By inhibiting that flow, the tailwind reduces lift. There's no better recipe for a microburst than the weather conditions at Dallas-Fort Worth on the day of the crash. It had been extremely hot all day, and hot air rises. When that hot air meets the cold, moist air in the storm clouds, it cools instantly and rushes violently back to Earth. A microburst.
It is a tiny thing, meteorologically speaking, compared to a big storm or a snowstorm or a hurricane. It's just like a needle in a haystack. At its maximum strength, it's no more than 2 miles across, and it lasts no more than 15 minutes. So if you look at that little space and time window, it's very small. And so the probability of hitting one is low.
The odds may be slim, but planes do fly into microbursts. In 1975, an Eastern Airlines flight landing in New York flew into a microburst. It slammed the plane into the ground, killing 113 people. Then, in 1982, a microburst killed another 153 people when it struck a Pan Am 727, taking off from New Orleans. It was clear that 136 people on Flight 191 had become the latest victims of a microburst. Investigators had their culprit.
Unbelievable.
And thanks to Flight 191's advanced data recorder, they could paint a remarkably accurate picture of it. The killer had essentially been caught on tape. But what the flight data recorder doesn't explain is how such an experienced crew fell victim to a killer
You're in good shape.
they were all trained to overcome. When Lena compares the pilot's actions to the actions of the microburst,
What's your speed?
he uncovers details of a fight to the death. A fight that the Delta pilots almost won.
Lose it all of a sudden. There it is.
He seemed to know what he was going to hit.
What's your speed?
The increase in airspeed prompted First Officer Price to reduce power to his engines. Power that he would desperately need in just a few seconds.
You're gonna lose it all of a sudden. There it is.
When Price and Connors entered the downdraft,
Push it up.
they were less than 250 meters from the ground.
The captain knew the characteristics of a microburst. He'd obviously been given an introduction to wind shear and microburst characteristics in his flight training.
When Connors and Price encountered the microburst's tailwind, there was very little they could do. They had insufficient speed and altitude with which to maneuver. If a pilot encounters a strong tailwind at 3,000 meters, he can point his nose down and dive to pick up speed and generate lift. It's called trading altitude for airspeed. But that trade wasn't available to Price and Connors. They were just 150 meters off the ground when the tailwind struck. The only way for them to gain airspeed was from their engines.
Push it up. Way up.
Co-pilot responds, airplane stabilizes. I can see that most pilots would say, well, we're through with that, and range is going to stop, we're going to land.
Momentarily, their efforts seem to pay off. Their airspeed increases, their plunge is halted. But with Flight 191 less than 150 meters from the ground, this particular microburst delivered the ultimate blow. A fierce crosswind that forces their plane to bank dangerously to the right. Combined with the microburst's other winds, the crew was defenseless.
TOGA is takeoff go-around mode. And what it means to a pilot in that regime of flight is let's abandon the approach. We're no longer going to try to land this airplane. We want to do everything we can now to survive the wind condition that we've entered.
The skill and experience of the pilots were no match for this microburst. It was too big, its winds too powerful and unpredictable. The entire fight lasted only 47 seconds.
The pilots of Delta Flight 191 did their very best to recover from this situation, and it didn't work out.
Investigators were left with one perplexing question. Why had Connors flown into the storm in the first place?
Prior to 1985, the radars on board the aircraft were built to detect thunderstorms, essentially heavy areas of precipitation. They were not effective. They weren't not even designed to detect a microburst. So those radars were essentially useless at low altitudes for looking at the microburst phenomena.
Microbursts are invisible, but they generally emerge from storm clouds. That's why pilots are trained not to fly into storms if they see lightning.
It's a pretty good size cell, and I'd rather not go through it. I'd rather go around it one way or the other.
When I can, I'll turn you into Blue Ridge. It'll be about 010 radial.
010. Oh, Roger.
Captain Connors was not a risk taker. He was known as a cautious pilot.
I'm glad we didn't have to go through that, yes.
It's hard to blame the aircrew. Their job is to avoid thunderstorms, and there's probably a forecast for thunderstorms every day at Dallas in the summertime. Which ones do you avoid? And it's a very difficult problem.
Earlier in the flight, Connors had flown around bad weather. Investigators can only conclude that he underestimated the storm in his path at the foot of runway 17 left.
When you're in a landing sequence at an airport like Dallas or Atlanta or Chicago, and you see other airplanes ahead that are landing uneventfully, you might get the impression that there's a thunderstorm there, but I'm going to pass through it very quickly, and it's not going to be a factor for me.
Airports like DFW have sophisticated systems in place to provide weather information to pilots. A thunderstorm at the end of a runway is the kind of threat they were designed to identify. But this deadly storm managed to foil those systems. As Flight 191 was approaching the airport, the weather at DFW was changing very quickly.
Attention all aircraft listening. There's a little rain shower just north of the airport.
Captain Connors heard that part of the message, but then he switched his radio frequency for his final landing instructions. The Delta crew never heard the last part of this message about weather ahead.
There's a little bitty thunderstorm sitting right on the final.
There was an observation 2 minutes before the accident that there was a wall of water at the threshold of the runway. It's been my contention that that information would have been very important to the flight crew.
Radar readouts from the day of the crash indicate that the storm cell Connors and Price flew into grew out of nothing in a matter of minutes.
This is 2 minutes before the accident.
The readout shows the beginnings of a weather cell at the foot of runway 17 left.
This is 3 minutes after the accident. We have a new cell right at the threshold of the runway that wasn't evident in the previous pictures.
This explains why Rufus Lewis was able to land his Learjet. The microburst was just beginning to form when he was approaching the runway.
Many people think that there was a huge vertical development that the pilots recognized and they just decided to go fly through it anyway. And I maintain, and I think the evidence proves it, that that was not the case. They didn't recognize this new developing cell. They did get into the storm beneath the cell, but it was heavy rain. They weren't worried about that. Then the hammer fell. It was too late.
It's small. It's the length of a runway, roughly, and it doesn't last very long. So it's something that can happen so quickly that many accidents have occurred because nobody knew it was there.
The storm arrived at the foot of runway 17 left virtually unannounced. But once there, it attracted a lot of attention. Pilots on the ground, as well as trained weather observers, saw the worsening storm. But they all saw it too late to warn the crew of Delta 191. The storm did show up on a radar screen at the Fort Worth Air Traffic Control Center. But at the time of the crash, the meteorologist on duty was in the cafeteria on a meal break.
If the flight crew had had any idea that there would be a severe event in front of them, they would have missed the approach.
Investigators conclude that the Delta crash was caused by the pilot's decision to continue their approach into the storm. A decision that was made because the crew wasn't warned about the hazard. In 1985, there were basic systems at airports that could detect dangerous winds, but they could not reliably detect a microburst.
On the ground, there were systems called low-level wind shear alerting systems that primarily looked for differences in wind speed around the airport and on the airport. Unfortunately, these sensors tended to be spaced so far apart that a microburst could actually exist in between them and escape detection, or at least detection in time to warn a pilot of the threat.
But a microburst detection system to overcome this problem had been developed. It was being tested in Denver and working very well.
What we found out is that Doppler radar, which is on the ground, is incredibly effective in detecting microbursts. And in fact, it can detect about 98% of a microburst.
Conventional radar uses radio waves to measure precipitation inside a storm. Doppler also sends out radio waves. But by measuring the frequency of returning waves, Doppler can also calculate the movement of the winds inside a storm.
And if you look through the Doppler radar, you see a part of it that's going away from the radar and a part that's coming towards the radar. And if it's small, it's absolutely a microburst. It can be nothing else. So it has what we call an unambiguous signature of a microburst, which means we got it.
Since Doppler radar could see a microburst, controllers could use it to warn crews of their presence. The Denver research resulted in an important new system at airports: Terminal Doppler Weather Radar. When the system detects dangerous conditions, it relays a warning to air traffic controllers, who can then alert pilots.
Flight 236, microburst alert. 50 knot bar, 1 mile final, say intentions.
After the crash of Delta 191, the Federal Aviation Authority, the FAA, hurried to install terminal Doppler weather radar at high-risk airports. Dallas-Fort Worth was one of the first. The domes containing the specialized radar are now a common fixture at major airports around the world. But radar on the ground can't get the warning to the pilots fast enough.
We also have an issue of ground-based systems in that it takes time to communicate the threat to the crew. The system has to detect it on the ground. It would typically go to a control position in the control tower and be relayed by voice to the pilot, which can introduce a delay of 10, 15, 20 seconds, which could be very critical.
Planes also needed onboard microburst detection. A team from NASA began developing such a system by flying into the most dangerous microbursts they could find.
0. Here we go. Take it. Straight ahead.
By risking their own lives, they would eventually save thousands of others. Delta Airlines Flight 191 is the latest in a string of crashes attributed to a microburst. Since 1964, microbursts were shown to be the cause of 26 accidents, claiming more than 500 lives. The public is unnerved. Politicians are demanding answers. The killer has to be stopped.
The body count is building, and this particular crash tipped the scales as far as the federal government was concerned.
The crash of Delta 191 showed that seconds count when planes encounter a microburst.
You're going to lose it all of a sudden. There it is.
Increasing alert times
Push it up. Way
could
up.
save more lives, especially if a microburst detector was mounted right on the plane.
If you can provide the airplane with 10, 15, 20 seconds of advance warning, pilots push the throttles up, they build airspeed, they build altitude, they build energy. It's like money in the bank. By the time they get to the microburst during a recovery, they can survive.
Aviation experts had to find a way to give all pilots those critical 20 seconds. To develop that technology, they would embark on a high-risk, unprecedented research project. They would fly a 737 into the most severe microbursts they could find.
We did a very careful risk analysis of all the possible dangers that could occur. And initially, the first reaction was, you want to do what with an airplane? You want to fly it through a microburst?
In the summer of 1991, NASA modified a Boeing 737 and went hunting for microbursts. The idea was to identify onboard technology that could warn pilots of a microburst in their path.
The airborne solution brings detection right into the cockpit, so the pilot sees exactly what's in front of the aircraft, and when an alert is given, there's no time delay.
Ground speed 234.
The NASA researchers were testing 3 separate systems for detecting microbursts. Modified Doppler radar housed in the 737's nose, a laser radar under its forward cargo bay, and a side-mounted infrared device to measure changes in air temperature. Each of those systems was wired to banks of computers in the plane's cabin. A spotter on the ground could find a microburst and quickly direct the plane towards it.
Roger, control 515. We're rolling.
Roger, understand your roll. TDWR and after control.
Range.
Range, 45 miles. Ground speed, 240. Here we go. Take it. Straight ahead.
Need to come left about 10 degrees, 15 degrees.
Well, when you spotted a microburst, it was all business. It was how do we get there, how do we get to the right altitude, the right airspeed, the right position, when to begin data collection. So people were quite busy during these flights. But yeah, it was exciting. We wanted to find them, we wanted to penetrate them.
With every microburst, the 3 onboard detection systems were put to the test. Researchers on the plane could instantly see which instrument was doing the best job of picking up the microburst ahead.
Behind the aft flight deck, we had pallets of equipment where the radar engineers, the laser engineers, and the data recording engineers could sit and ensure that each system was performing as expected.
Ground speed, 234. Dead ahead, maybe 1 degree to the left.
Let's go straight through this one.
Here we go. Take it. Straight ahead.
We started with very, very weak microburst. Again, we had the ground-based radar telling us what we were about to go into. So we started with very weak microbursts, gained experience, then gradually worked up to stronger and stronger ones. You would see the rain begin to fall, and you would feel a sinking feeling. It'd be a little settling, a little like an elevator starting down.
A few minutes here before we touch down. What do you see as now?
So any apprehension that the crew may have had initially about going through them was actually replaced later with joy at finding them.
Here comes the center of the target, right now. 242 on the ground speed. Wind's gone away. Look for a tailwind.
Watch.
Lost some altitude there, too. There, the wind's gone around the tail at 10 knots. Good strong downdraft in the middle of it. Just sucked 100 feet in almost no time at all.
Our good performance decreased, too.
We were about 850 and we dropped to 750. Beautiful.
The Langley researchers flew into dozens of microbursts over the course of their research. The project proved that the forward-looking Doppler radar was the only system that could consistently give pilots advanced warnings of a microburst ahead.
What we found was that the Doppler radars could detect an extremely wide variety of microbursts.
It's lightning coming out of that one.
If the crew of Delta 191 had a system to warn them of microbursts, they could have boosted power to their engines and started climbing before they encountered it. That might have given them the speed and the altitude which they sorely lacked when they began their battle with the storm. The Langley flight tests had, in effect, tamed the microburst menace. After the NASA tests, the FAA certified a Doppler-based warning system for planes. Today, forward-looking Doppler radar is standard equipment on commercial flights around the world.
The good news out of all of this tragedy is so many things have now happened, from radar to ground-based systems to airborne systems, and especially to training for pilots. We think that microburst accidents are a thing of the past.
If there is one crash that we can look back on now and say, this made things safer because we learned from it, it was Delta 191.
The changes made after the crash of Delta 191 have saved countless lives. Captain Connors and First Officer Price lost their fight against a microburst, but their struggle did manage to expose and disarm an invisible killer.